Oh, let me put mute.
Yeah, if everybody can go on mute, I'm going to stop my video just so it's not distracting. So last week, just to recap, last week we went through religious art and architecture, predominantly focused on churches and chapels in Quebec. And then we ended by saying that we were now going to come into looking at painting sort of post-Confederation, what that looked like once Canada had been established as an actual country. Now, before we fully get into that, oh, Astrid, my sound is working for everyone else. I don't know if maybe you have to turn the volume up on your computer. Sorry, it's just if somebody doesn't have sound. Sound is working for everybody else?
Sound is perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, so
Yeah,
yes, I'm just going to take.
You know, when you sign in, it says join with audio, join with video.
Yeah.
So I didn't know if that meant for us or for you, but I always click both.
Both, yeah. Join audio. Sorry, I'm just writing her so she doesn't miss anymore. Okay.
She could sign off and sign in again.
Okay, I'll write that in the chat. Okay, so before we go into post-Confederation painting, I just wanted to give you a look at what painting kind of looked like before Confederation, when it was more in documentary style type of paintings. There were paintings that were more genre studies, which we will see with Cornelius Krieghoff. And there were a lot of studies that were done of like the native peoples, which Paul Kane was a big figure in that. Now, when Confederation came in is around the same time that photography was coming in. So photography took over for a lot of documentary style imagery. And then that's when like romanticism and stuff came in more so, and we will see that moving forward. But first, I just wanted to give this sort of like contrasting view of the artwork of Paul Kane and Cornelius Krieghoff, because they were two prominent figures around the same time, but doing very different work. So Paul Kane was known primarily for his images of the Western landscape and the customs of different indigenous peoples. Paul Kane, he made one of the most extensive pictorial records of the 19th century Northwest. He traveled from Thunder Bay to Fort Vancouver on the Pacific coast at a time when the fur trade was beginning to decline. So he worked in graphite, watercolor, oil, and produced more than 700 images, as well as journal descriptions as he was moving along the country. So this is the kind of imagery that we will see from him. And I'm going to explain sort of his beginnings a little bit more, but I'd like to also talk about the problem with his imagery as well. So he worked a lot with like the indigenous people, and like a meeting with Sir George Simpson at the Hudson's Bay Company secured his extensive expedition from one side of the country to the other. He had been granted free board and lodging and the transportation from one side of the country to the other. to create these images of sort of Indian, quote unquote, Indian curiosities. So his sketches and journals were the basis of his immensely successful classic wanderings of an artist, as they were called. But there's also problems with the way that these images were depicted. So here we have Big Snake, chief of the Blackfoot Indians, recounting his war exploits to 5 subordinate chiefs. So this is inspired by a display of works by the artist George Catlin, which Kane undertook a lengthy journey aimed at representing these kinds of indigenous peoples, as I said, of what was known as British North America, in a series of sketches and drawings. He later worked many of them up into paintings, which is what we see here. And they were adopted as what were seen as conversation pieces. Now, the problem with this imagery is that they're very Eurocentric. Like, they've been romanticized in a lot of ways that make them not realistic to the events or accounts that were actually happening. And the native culture, or the native people of today, when they look at these kinds of paintings, they have big problems with it because it's not accurate in describing visually the way that the people looked. As I said, everything was romanticized and sort of amped up to make it look more exotic and to have that Eurocentric sort of feel of the way that they did their contours and the way that they, you know, created their feathers or the different kinds of clothing that we see. So here's another one called Fishing Lodges of the Clallams from Vancouver Island. So for this specific one, Kane spent time on Vancouver Island visiting the south shore of the Juan de Fuca Strait, where there was a Clallam village not far from Fort Victoria. While he's eager to create a visual record of First Nation lifestyles, he produced paintings in a distinctly romantic manner, as I was saying. So everything is sort of softened over and generalized here. If you look at the people, they all look extremely similar. They don't have distinct features. What's also interesting that we would see kind of in European painting that was done in like Gothic style or even in early Renaissance, if you look at the figure that is in the middle, in the center, in the foreground, it's meant to be a child, but it actually just looks like a small adult. And we see that a lot in European classic painting. It's interesting to see it here, but Kane did a lot of studies in Europe, which is another reason why his paintings have this Eurocentric feel, because that's where he studied. So this is one that doesn't involve the native people in the indigenous people in the view, but I just wanted to give you an example of some of the other work that he did. So this is Fort Garry in mid-June of 1846. When he arrived at the Red River Colony, where he executed the sketches on which this painting is based. The canvas is something of an exception in the artist's work, since he generally portrayed pure landscapes, First Nation camps, or buffalo hunts. Fort Garry, site of what is now Winnipeg, appears on the right, while counterbalancing it on the left are the first cathedral of St. Boniface and the Grey Nuns Convent, which were the heart of the local Francophone community. What I find interesting in this painting is the large tree really in the very center, or just like off center of the painting. Like, usually an artist would avoid putting such a large element right in the middle of the painting to try and avoid a focal point. But because you have the two different sides of the water that are depicting different sort of, not colonies, but like civilization. The eye is drawn into the back on both sides to try and figure out what each side is. So that kind of eliminates that big tree as being a focal point, but I still find that it was really risky. And then here we're back to his classic imagery of the indigenous people in his piece, Horse Race Among the Blackfoot Indians. And I mean, although his paintings were, you know, considered like appropriation of a culture without properly depicting them, his technique, his skill level is very good. Like we can see that the painting, that the figures that are in the foreground are painted a lot more with a lot more saturated paint color than the figures in the background, so that we can see that even though they're kind of all on the same plane of field, they appear as they're further away. That too is classic European study for perspective studies that we see dating back way to the early Renaissance. And here finally I find is the best example of how his paintings were, how they romanticized and Eurocentrified the idea of the Canadian Indian in the death of, I don't even know how to pronounce this, Homo Sesizani or Big Snake from 1858 to 1602. And this was a color lithograph, which is like a print embossed on woven paper. Just, I mean, the technique, like I said, is beautiful and the imagery is beautiful, but it's just not accurate. And this was a big problem with many artists who were depicting the same kind of imagery at that time. So on the other hand, we have Cornelius Krieghoff. So Krieghoff painted images of Canada when the development of popular imagery of the country was in its early stages. He was an entrepreneur and created a populist vision of the country's landscape and peoples, describing the customs and traditions of various native peoples, but also, well, lesser on the native peoples, but also the characteristics and activities of the French Canadian settler, or what we now know as le habitant. So Krieghoff was one of the first ones to really portray imagery of the Quebec habitant and what that lifestyle looked like. So Krieghoff was not Canadian born. He was born in Amsterdam, but he emigrated to New York and joined the United States Army in 1837. There he met his wife, and then they eventually moved to Montreal, where he began working as an artist. He, like a lot of artists, went to Paris. He went in 1844, where he studied masterworks at places like Le Louvre, but then he returned to Montreal 2 years later and began advertising himself as an artist and established a studio and began his career really at that point. He then moved to Quebec City in 1853, where he painted city views and the surrounding region. So really his relationship with the Quebec habitant developed because of the fact that he lived in both Montreal and Quebec City, which were the centers of the French population in Canada. So here we have French Canadian habitants playing cards from 1848. So this is like classic imagery, early imagery for Krieghoff. We see that we have les habitants, they're playing cards. It's a genre scene, classic with a dog at the foot of a stair. We have remnants of something that has been cooked with a pot and a cup. You can see, you can get an idea for what people's homes looked like at the time. You know, the bed, there's no living room, dining room, kitchen type thing. The bed is right beside the table where people are all gathered, which, you know, really shows as the heart, the center of the home. And we get an idea for their clothing as well, with like the toques, the red and the blue toques, which we still see as classic wear for people during wintertime in this province. We're feeling far away from it right now with the heat, but enjoy the heat while it lasts, because that clothing is not far off again. So here's one of my favorites from him. This is called Storm and Falls. So this is one of Krieghoff's first paintings of a waterfall. Unusually for him, the landscape includes no sign of human life. The handling of the rocks, simultaneously realistic and expressive, is remarkable. So it's realistic and expressive, it's romanticized at the same time. The subtlety of the chromatic harmonies, combinations of brown, green, and red tones is particularly striking, as is the way the topography of this site is dominated by the colors, shapes, and textures. So the foreground is just as mesmerizing as the middle ground, as is the background. I mean, the detail of the brightness of the white waterfall contrasted against the darkness of the stormy sky, and then the trees in between, and the rocks, the detail on the rocks in the foreground is just beautiful. And this, unlike that example that we saw from Paul Kane, where, you know, like I said, the tree was right in the middle, and I found that confusing for his layout of his painting. This is a classic example of, you have a lot of strong elements in the painting, but even though the white is very bright, well, the sky is very dark, and your eye bounces from corner to corner in the painting. So there's really no one focal point. A very, very successful painting. Here we have something that's a little bit more classically European. So this is called The Studio from 1845. And it's reminiscent of some European studio pieces that we saw if you participated in the classes that we did for Renaissance and Baroque, and even going into modern art. This is a classic portrayal of a self-portrait of an artist in his studio, working with his many paintings around him. And in most cases, there are usually paintings that are portrayed in the image that can also be recognized as artists of their paintings that are already known. So here we see that Krieghoff is doing some close-up portraits, which were not super classic for his style, but you can also see that he has some landscape work on the wall, and he's working on a genre scene. What the artist also uses here is a chiaroscuro, which is a Baroque technique of using extreme highlight versus extreme shadow. So you're kind of, as much as there's one portion of the painting that's very brightly lit, it doesn't just take the focus, because your eye is like struggling to try and see what is in the more dimly lit corner of the painting. This is one of his most famous pieces. This is called White Horse Inn by Moonlight. So drawing inspiration from the Dutch painting of the period, Krieghoff created this spectacular image towards the end of his Montreal period. One of his largest works, it depicts a horse-drawn sleigh that has stopped at a country inn, where the passengers will rest while the horses are changed. The tenor of the picture is romantic, with its winter scene bathed in moonlight, and it's rich in detail that is brought out by the moonlight. We can see here that he was a real observer of nature and atmosphere and dark versus light. The trees look like they have newly fallen snow, like they're not muted or flat, like they look very rounded, like looks like those like big clouds of snow that you see that fall onto trees after a heavy snowfall. One of the things that I love about Canadian landscapes, and we'll see this as we move forward, is, you know, in a lot of European landscapes, you really only get the feel of the 3 seasons, unless it's, you know, Russian art or places that have big snow like us. But what's really beautiful about Canadian landscapes, and particularly ones that are done in the colder provinces, are the ways in which artists are able to work with white. It's really amazing how many different expressions of white and hues of white and shadow work that are accomplished by Canadian landscape artists. So here's another one of his winter landscapes, entitled Winter Landscape. So Krieghoff was fond of presenting the daily winter survival activities of the French Canadians. In this frontier landscape, family members gather, chop and transport firewood on an icy winter day. In the foreground, a coureur des bois, an independent fur trader identified by his woolen coat, red sash, and fur hat, appears to be asking for directions. So as I was saying, like the use for white, and you don't necessarily notice it when you're looking, you know, just at one painting. You can say like, oh, wow, that's nice. Like it's a winter scene. There's a lot of snow. But when I was building the curriculum for this course, for these classes, I looked at a lot of winter landscapes back to back. And it was then that it really hit me how difficult it is to deal in like monochromatic, like you're dealing with a lot of white. So between like the snow and the cloud of the sky, you really have to be strategic on the ways in which you shade your white and where you highlight your white to make it successful in its highlights. So here we see that he's starting to move more into a romantic era, and we're getting closer to like Confederation time, closer to 1867, which is when like the Romanticism sort of really starts to come in. But this is a real romanticized style for Krieghoff, because his lines are getting a little bit softer, his colors are getting a little bit softer, his sky, I mean, very expressive as always, but now paired with like a very grand landscape and small people, like people who are juxtaposed to make the landscape look huge and to make them look small with regard to nature, which is one of the qualities of Romanticism. I love the way that the clouds cast shadows on Owl's Head Mountain in this, and the way that the rock cliff on the left-hand side with that bright red tree is really highlighted. And again, another thing that's beautiful about Canadian landscapes is the seasons, right? The fact that we see this fall landscape, it's like you can almost feel the air at that time of year. So here's a more classic style portrait that Krieghoff was famous for. And this is kind of, you know, this isn't really romanticized. This is more documentary style. So the moccasin seller crossing the St. Lawrence at Quebec City. So things that strike us about this image are the fact that the moccasin seller is not dressed super warmly. I mean, considering those big chunks of ice that are surrounding what I think is her, but it might be him. You can see Quebec City in in the background there on the top left with the flag flying. And there's some indication of maybe a tent at the foot of the hill there behind the ice on the left-hand side. And you can see some sort of points maybe from buildings right behind the figure. You can see that the moccasin seller has the moccasins attached to their clothing and that basket being pulled on their head. So this seems like quite a labor-intensive crossing of that St. Lawrence to go and sell those moccasins. And we feel that through the imagery. And again, the fact that around the moccasin seller is basically just different versions and variations of white and gray. We really get that feeling that it's cold. Comparatively, you can also see in this painting all the cracks that are in the canvas that it needs. When the image was taken, it needed some restoration. So here is like a counterpart for that. So we had the moccasin seller, and now we have the hunter in the winter. This is clearly a man. The idea that this is what they called the coureur des bois, which wore the red sash and the coat and the red toque. So a coureur des bois was really like a hunter, forager, people who were very comfortable living in the woods. And initially they were, indigenous people, but then also French like habitants that lived very closely with the indigenous people. And then through sort of intermarrying, it kind of became this kind of hybrid of people who lived from the land and the settlers. This hybrid became the coureur des bois, who, like I said, were hunters and foragers and gatherers. Oh, we have a question. I think that this painting would have been accepting to the native because it more accurately depicts, like, it wasn't trying to romanticize anything by making it overly romantic. Like this image seems pretty, it doesn't seem like, for lack of a better term, like jazzed up to me. It seems pretty realistically descriptive.
Okay, I was talking, Erin, about the moccasin seller.
Oh, the moccasin seller, sorry.
Yeah, I didn't get my question in fast enough.
Okay, we'll go back to the moccasin seller here. Again, I think it would be, because it's not really romanticized, like if it was like a lot of the times, if it was a woman, the women were sort of hypersexualized. And a lot of the time, if it was the men, it was making them look very sort of exotic and regal. And I mean, I think that this depiction shows struggle. Like, I think that this moccasin seller looks like they're having a hard time getting across that St. Lawrence crossing to sell their moccasins. Like, I think that there's a nice amount of detail that's shown on the actual moccasin, but I think it was more documentary than it was romanticized, Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so here again, this is another interesting style that we see around this time in art history, is this sort of like framed oval image moving away from just using the canvas as is. This is like really framing it as you're looking through like a viewfinder, like a telescope, but yeah, kind of like a telescope, like a viewfinder, like as somebody who's out in the wilderness, who's looking at different views, who they're an explorer, they're searching. It's this kind of idea of looking through this scope at like the grandeur of nature. So this is called Chaudière from the late 1850s. And this is when Krieghoff had returned to a theme of waterfalls, just like we saw before his other waterfalls, but the other waterfalls were very close up. But this one is from far away. So it focuses on various cataracts located some distance from Quebec City. He painted them in similar oval formats, suggesting a series that included the Chaudière Falls on the Ottawa River at Bytown, which is now Ottawa. So this airy composition shows the waterfall against the backdrop of a spectacular sunset. The aesthetic value of the majestic landscape seems to be confirmed by the presence at the lower left of an artist and his dog. So we see right at the bottom left that you have the artist and his dog, which are, like I said before, and when we saw the example of the Owl's Head, that fall scene where there were those two people in the boat, and I mentioned, which is what's happening here again, it's the idea of that romanticism, which romanticizes the grandeur of the landscape. So it aims to make the human seem so tiny against what is like nature. And this sky is particularly different and romanticized for Krieghoff, because as we've seen in his other paintings, usually it's really like a snowy sky, you know, in the sense that it's kind of white on white, or it's very dramatic, but very dramatic with dark, stormy colors. This is like a cotton candy pink and purple and blue kind of dramatic sunset type sky.
But I have a question, but you say that, but isn't it just maybe because that's what he was looking at, as opposed to, I mean, if he just goes out and paints and this is the way the sky is when he's painting, then isn't it just?
Not really, because I mean, first of all, most of his paintings, like an artist will go out and he'll look at a bunch of different landscapes and a bunch of different imagery, but number one, he's going to choose which ones speak to him most. And number two, he's going to use what's called artistic license and not necessarily paint it exactly how it is, but paint it how he sees it. Like, as somebody who makes paintings myself, like if I'm doing a landscape, well, sometimes I'll switch a tree from here to there because I don't like it, or I'll make my sky look more vibrant than it does because the sky isn't looking overly vibrant right now, you know?
Okay.
So there's that aspect in that, like, classically we see from Krieghoff's paintings that he always chooses very dramatic lighting for his skies, which is either dramatic in the sense that it's like whitewash, or it's dramatic in the sense that it's stormy or snowy. Now, the other thing that you have to think about is that this is 1858, and this isn't Impressionism. One of the big things of Impressionism is that this is when artists were first able to go out and actually paint in the countryside and paint the landscape from where they were sitting. Because around that time, around the 1880s, like 1885 or 6 or something, was when they developed paint in tubes. Before that, artists had to mix all their own paints as they began to paint. So all of these paintings that we're seeing up until Impressionism basically are done from composite sketches that were created out in the open air, but just graphite, so just pencil or charcoal sketches, and then the colors were added when they went back to the studio. So a lot of the times these colors were done from memory, or they were done from little indications of color with graphite pencils.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I never knew that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and this is the blacksmith shop, another one of his famous paintings, which is reminiscent of the inn at Whitehorse that we saw. But this one is done during a snowstorm. So it's one of the last works painted by Krieghoff. Blurred by falling snow, the winter genre scene depicts activity around a blacksmith shop as horse-drawn sleighs arrive. Travelers bundled in snow-covered clothes are climbing the steps to the house for a rest stop, while one man is leading a horse to the forge. Sleighs, horses, dog, and garments are all meticulously detailed. This picturesque painting is emblematic of Krieghoff's style and is featured on a stamp issued by the Canada Post in 1972. So, like, interesting facts. So now that's two images that we've seen so far. One from the native printer, Ken Juak, and the other one from Krieghoff. So two images that we've seen that became Canadian stamps. So it's kind of interesting to be able to relate those things together and to think back, well, maybe you've seen this stamp before. I think everybody taking this course was around in 1972. So, and I think I've even seen this image on old stamps. But it's that very classic image of Krieghoff. When, if you know Krieghoff's work, I think that like this or the Inn at Whitehorse is kind of the classic imagery that you associate with him. What I find so beautiful about this painting is the way that, like, you can almost see every snowflake. It's crazy. He was doing splatter painting before splatter painting existed. And think about that, you know, splatter painting is when you kind of flick your paintbrush at the canvas. Like, there's no way that he did this by doing every single dot. So he must have, I mean, although they seem perfectly spaced. And there was no spray painting going on or airbrush at that point. Just gorgeous. Okay, and so that was Cornelius Krieghoff and Paul Kane that I wanted you to see before we go. I'm going to do a new share now. Before we go into our next, well, let me close this. Let me stop this share. Before we go into our next section, which is painting after Confederation. Oops, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get to the right screen here. There we go. So here we're going into, is there any questions about Kane or about Krieghoff before we move any further? No. So you're all seeing post-Confederation painting 1867 to 1910, visual accounts of a new country and its people. Everyone good? All right. So prior to Confederation, as I was saying, the documentary tradition dominated Canadian painting, whether recording the frontier, high society in the garrison towns, or the scenic wonders of a new land. Romanticism, a major European movement preoccupied with imagination, emotion, and the natural world, was a common style in the mid 19th century, and moving towards late 19th century, which was marked by Confederation. We saw this romanticism, but also we saw scenes of Western expansion, and there was less recorded documentary style, because that had kind of been taken over by photography for many occasions. So around this time, Victorian artists escaped to an ideal world of rural landscapes. They also established professional art societies where they could exhibit and promote and sell their works, which were mostly located in Montreal and Toronto. The search for the Canadian landscape by Notman photographers. We saw Notman before. So Notman like had this whole style of photography and had studios. Was connected with the railway expansion, which was opening up the new country. So painters had traveled from Montreal by train in the earlier years to sketch in Quebec, and the valleys that connected Quebec and Montreal. So now they brought in their vision as the transcontinental line of the Canadian Pacific Railway edged its way across the prairies and through the Rockies. A man named Sir William Van Horn, president of the railway and himself an art collector, gave artists free passes to produce promotional pictures for the CP rail. Canadian art achieved new prestige with the founding of the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts during 1880 as well. During the 1880s and the 1890s, Europe was once again became the model for Canadian artists and painters who aspired to study Parisian academy styles and the salon. And but it wasn't like the avant-garde artists that attracted the Canadian artists. It was the French and English conservative masters. So we'll kind of start to see that style. And as we move from 1867 towards 1910, and the reason why I stopped at 1910 is because in the early 1900s is where we start to see impressionist imagery come up. And then really in 1910 was when the Beaver Hall group, like I said, and Impressionism, modernism started to take over. So here we have Evening on the Wharf of Montreal Harbor, which shows a typical view of the Port of Montreal, which was already an economic hub, playing a decisive role in Canada's history at the sometimes accidental effects produced by photographic framing. So other Canadian artists were inspired by the Port of Montreal, including the painter Adrien Hébert many years later. Best known as, actually as an illustrator, the Montreal artist Henry Sandman was also proficient in watercolors, oils, and photography, which he learned from William Notman. So when they talk about photographic framing, you know, Notman was teaching this photographic framing, and artists at the time, now that there were multiple media that were available, that you weren't just confined to drawing and painting, you could do painting, drawing, photography, as you were saying here. Well, then you start to use your techniques and your skills from one media across the others as well. So that's where you get the idea of photographic framing, which is, you know, framing an image in a lens and then and framing it properly. So as you know, going back to what I was saying about Paul Kane, when he put that tree right in the middle of the field of vision. Well, that's not really photographic framing. In photographic framing, you would put a tree on an edge type thing. So here, this image of the boat, it takes up most of the frame of the image. It's almost like when you do a portrait of a person, you put them in the center. So this is almost like photographic framing of a portrait of this boat, so to speak. If that makes sense. So sorry, Sandman specialized in large composite photographs, and it was likely his experience as a photographer and his fondness for illustration that led him to paint cityscapes filled with these kind of anecdotal scenes. So Sandman was not the only artist to depict like a picturesque Montreal. A few years later, we have Alfred Brosseau, I think we'll see a piece from after. Yeah, we will. Portrayed the hustle and bustle of Place d'Armes. So think about Alfred Brosseau and Place d'Armes, because we will see his piece later. So interesting to see the idea of the Port of Montreal. Like I said, the boat is really these two boats are really the central figures in this painting, not the people. The people are secondary, but we get to see the relationship between the people on the boat and the cargo that is coming off or going on to the boats. Barrels of most likely wine or whiskey, sacks of most likely grain. An interesting little historical pic. So here we have Francis N. Hopkins canoes in the fog from Lake Superior. Interesting to see, there's a seagull in the painting there. So seagulls have been around that long, flying around us, looking for scraps. So this is the work of a female artist, a rarity at the time. Francis N. Hopkins has depicted herself from the back in the nearest canoe, making sketches for a painting. So you can see her white hat there. Reduced to a large diagonal formed by the paddled craft, the composition differs from those of the grand sublime landscapes of the day, such as we saw a few with the Krieghoff, and we'll see a few more moving forward. The thick fog into which the canoes are heading accentuates the romantic spirit of the scene. In the late 19th century, merchants in the new country began abandoning the canoe in favor of more modern, less expensive means of transport like the railroad. Little is known about the artistic training of Francis Hopkins, who was born into an upper middle class English family that included other professional artists. After arriving to what was known as Lower Canada in 1858, Hopkins sometimes accompanied her husband on the canoe trips he made as the agent in charge of the Hudson's Bay Company fur trade based in Montreal. These expeditions became her favorite subject matter. Like the crossing in canoes in a fog, the year 1869 signaled transition since Edward Martin Hopkins, which is her husband, took his retirement, and then the couple sailed back to England the following year. So there's just a question here.
Well, that was me, but it's obviously not a photo. It said photo of that boat. What did they mean?
Oh, I think it was just, I think maybe it
That's
was
a photo of the painting?
yeah, or maybe it was
Yeah,
a
yeah.
photo that was turned into a painting, or maybe when it said photo, when I do the titles of the photo, the titles of the paintings, I just copy and paste them from where I'm sourcing them
Yeah.
from, so as to not to change them. And where it says it here, it might have just had to do with the photographic framing of it.
Yeah, probably, because obviously it's not. It's
No.
gorgeous, though.
Or sometimes they make a photo. Hold on a second.
Oh, no, it says oil on canvas. I missed that. Yeah, yeah. Okay, I got it.
Where do you see photo?
Right at the end.
Oh yeah, the
Photo.
photo where the photo was sourced from, where I got it from.
Yeah. So oil on canvas. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
I got it. Thanks.
Okay. So I really like this painting. Sorry, going back to Francis Ann Hopkins. I really like this painting because I liked how it almost has like a little bit of an abstract feeling to it, because it's so like the fog it makes it such just like a color study, especially with like the shadows and the different boats that are moving away. And it's almost as if like if you look at the placement of the people in the boat that's closest to us, where we can actually see people, the placement of the people in the other two boats is very similar. So it almost looks like it's like a repeated image, which is why I say it reminds me of something that could be more contemporary, because of the way that it was created. I love how everything's super detailed in the foreground, and then it just sort of like you lose it as you go into the perspective of the painting, into like the distance. So here is something a little bit more classic. It's called Skating on at the Carnival with Victoria Rink in Montreal, and it portrays the fancy dress skating event held in honor of Prince Arthur, then in Montreal for military training. In those days, photography, like I said, photography required an exposure time that was too long to clearly capture a crowd of this size in a single shot, So William Notman photographed 150 people in their costumes, one by one in his studio. The portraits were assembled on a drawn background to create a composite image, which was then re-photographed and hand-painted. This composite photograph is the first of a long series of technical feats that made the Notman studio famous. That's incredible. In 1856, shortly after arriving in Montreal, Scottish-born William Notman, just going back to his history a little bit, opened his photography studio, and before long, the business was thriving. Using his networking skills, the enterprising photographer made his establishment a gathering place for Montreal's elite. He saw photographs as aesthetic objects, and the studio became a training ground for many young artists, like who we saw before, Henry Sandman, who painted backdrops and added colors to portraits for Notman. He's the first Canadian photographer to earn an international reputation. He opened franchise studios all across Canada and in the United States.
Erin, can I ask you?
Yeah.
Is this an ice rink with a giant tarp over it, or is it ice? I think I see a few people on
Yes.
skates.
Yes, it's an ice rink. People are skating on ice, and you can see that there's like the ceiling is buttressed. So I think
Buttressed, yeah.
Yeah, so I believe it's a hard ceiling and then decorated inside.
Wow.
Quite elaborate.
But an indoor rink in those days, that's unusual.
I know.
Indoor rink, yeah. Beautiful.
Gorgeous.
Yeah.
And the detail of like all the people, to think that there were 150 portraits done, and then that they were layered and placed on the field, like the field of vision, and then re-photographed and then colored in. Think about how long that must have taken. So here we have one of those like classic romantic landscapes. So this is Lucius R. Oh no, sorry. We're at Edgar Allan. Did I miss one? Whoops. Oh yes, I missed one. So in this landscape, we see that this is another one of those grandiose kind of landscapes where we see from the artist that, sorry, excuse me, where we see from the artist that he's doing that sort of Krieghoff style that we saw before, where you make the people look very, very small against the grandiose picture behind them, making sort of nature kind of seem otherworldly, and just giving a real feeling of the great Canadian outdoors. So this picture, I believe that it must have been done in, it's not written, but it must have been done in what looks like spring or beginning of summer, as everything is very kind of green gold. You know, we saw other paintings where it looked like it was the fall, where we saw that it was kind of midsummer, where everything seemed very colorful and vibrant. But I feel like this would either be the end of summer, beginning of fall, before the colors really change, or the end of spring, beginning of summer, where you have remnants of those kind of fall colors on the forest floor. And you have those kind of gold hues before everything gets really, really vibrant.
It says autumn on the Yamaska River.
Oh, I can't see. Sorry. Yeah, there you go. So autumn. So it's before the colors really get very, very, as I said, it was either fall or the beginning of fall or the end of spring, beginning of summer. So that I can't with my screen see that detail. I'm sorry. But anyway, like I said, so you have that feeling of the colors. So at the beginning of the fall, before the colors really hit to those oranges and reds, is when the golds and the greens start to sort of diminish in their vibrancy. you can follow the field of vision to go from the front left where the water of the river is at is at its widest, and you can follow it winding. And although we can't see the river go all the way back, you have an idea that it goes all the way back because you can see that it follows the shape of the different curvatures of the mountains. Oh, I just found my note for it. So, yeah, so in Edson's typical style, nature is rendered with great attention to the foreground details, as I was saying, with the mouth of the river, which gradually fade as a result of the atmospheric perspective. The presence of two tiny figures fishing on the bank heightens the impression of nature as both grandiose and intimate. So this is the idea that by celebrating Canada's vast expanses, landscape painting contributed to shaping the national discourse. So this really became one of the, when I talked about at the beginning, the first class, when I said that we were going to talk about what makes Canadian painting distinctly Canadian, this is one of the characteristics that formed distinctly Canadian landscape. We'll see as we move forward next week into Canadian Impressionism, and then the Group of Seven and the Beaver Hall group, which really gave Canada like a true identity in its painting techniques. But this grandiose romantic landscape was the beginning of that. Even when you study European painting, at this time in history, you don't see as much these kinds of expansive landscapes with this kind of like the mountain relief, and the different seasons. So that really contributed, like I said, to this kind of discourse in Canadian art history. So just a little detail that at the time of his death, Alan Edson was considered to be the best landscape artist that was born in Canada at the time. Because what we're seeing at this time in history is, a lot of the artists that I'm showing aren't actually born in Canada, but they moved to Canada when they were small children. And so they're considered to be Canadian artists. And I think that that's the kind of problem when we think, or one of the problems when we think about Canadian art history, is the fact that a lot of people aren't considered to be Canadian painters because they weren't born in Canada. But Canada is a relatively new country. So if your family immigrated to Canada when you were a child, or even when you were a teenager, or even you emigrated because you married somebody who was Canadian or whatever, you just came over to the country and made it your home. Well, if you practiced painting, if you had your practice and your craft in that country, well, then you should be considered having contributed to that art history. So even though artists at the time weren't necessarily born in Canada, they were great contributions to Canadian art history. Although it's just to be noted that he was born in Canada. So when he died, he was considered the best at the time who had been born in Canada. Now we're moving on to Lucius O'Brien. So this is Sunrise on the Saguenay. So Lucius O'Brien wrote in a letter, suppose that instead of exhibiting Canadian art, Canadian artists should help to represent Canada by such portrayal as they can give of the picturesque aspects of her scenery and life. Pictures and drawings of Canadian life and scenery would have in this connection an interest due to the subject and would materially help to make the country known and understood. So this speaks to that discourse that I just mentioned with Alan Edson's piece. And here, Lucius O'Brien, this is probably one of my favorite. This was the image that I put on the cover slide for this section. I think that this is probably my favorite romantic landscape, Canadian romantic landscape, because Lucius O'Brien's, like, he was determined to try and make that idea of romantic landscapes be distinctly Canadian at the time. So a landscape artist who worked in oils and watercolors, O'Brien was elected vice president of the Ontario Society of Artists. In 1879, O'Brien traveled to Ottawa to petition the newly appointed Governor General to accept the role of patron of the Ontario Society of Artists. However, the Marquis of Lorne proposed a grander plan to establish a national academy that would bring together the country's leading painters, sculptors, and architects. O'Brien became the Royal Canadian Academy's first president. His dedication to both the OSA and the RCA ensured their OSA being the Ottawa being the Ontario Society of Artists and the RCA being the Royal Canadian Academy, ensured their legacy as vital cultural institutions. So on May 6th, 1880, the Royal Academy held its first exhibition in Ottawa. O'Brien, the president, and each newly appointed academician was required to donate a work of art exemplary of his or her talent. O'Brien submitted Sunrise on the Saguenay, and it was immediately accepted with rave reviews. His detail, the saturation of color in the foreground compared to what it is in the background is, you know, everything is, or not to say that the saturation, because there's an equal amount of paint, but the depth of color. You know, you can see that in the background, he's used a lot of pastel colors, and then moving towards the foreground, we have very dark, dramatic colors. The boats and the people in the boats are again expressed very small, and even the two white birds that are beside the sailboat in the foreground are tiny in comparison to that great cliff in the Saguenay. It's hard to find colors that weren't used in this painting, and I think that that's one of the reasons that I love it. It's like you have browns and greens and yellows and reds, and then you have pinks and purples, light green, like pale, dusty green. And the detail on those cliffs, even to the little debris that's washed up onto shore at the beach, it's just beautiful. We'll see a few from him. This is the gate of the canyon. So again, a grand landscape. Beautiful details in the rocks. Both the rocks at the shoreline and also like the cliff rocks that we see in between the trees. And really the landscape taking, like the mountains taking up the entire frame of the painting, which is what we saw in the Saguenay one as well. It's like the rock cliff goes from the bottom of the painting all the way to the top, and we see this here too. It really gives you that idea of like those like expansive landscape and towering mountains. Here, the way that like it's dotted, like his technique that he used with his paintbrush, it's almost moving towards impressionism, in that you can really see the strokes. This one is the St. Lawrence Fishery. This one not as expansive, like this one seems more, a little bit more classic. But again, it's watercolor, this one, and to be able to achieve those bright colors with watercolor is still quite something. And here, Ottawa from the Rideau. Again, another one of his watercolors. So it's incredible to think that, like, back then, that's 1873, that's what Ottawa looked like. Going through these landscapes too, sometimes the ones that are, you know, landscapes of just nature, you might recognize a certain area, but it's particularly interesting when we get to see details of cityscapes in the background, or even cities, like city genre scenes, because it gives you an idea of how much things have developed from then until now. I think this is my favorite watercolor from him. This is the Grand Cross at Gull Cliff. I love how many birds are depicted in this painting, and how the ones that are more close to us are more defined, and then how they move backwards and they become less defined. But you can get an idea of that feeling of like the gulls sort of like circling you and being surrounded by birds. I find it really interesting too how rough the water seems, and how those two fishermen are just in that canoe. It's like you get the impression that they're about to crash up against those rocks. I also feel like the colors that were used in this painting, it gives you a little bit of like an exotic feel to it. If I hadn't seen the fishermen dressed that way, you know, with hats on and long sleeves and looking Caucasian, I might have thought that this was something from like, I don't know, something from like Africa or somewhere in the Far East. Like I find that look of like the rock cliffs, it almost looks like sand rather than rock. They look very choppy. And you can see that there's like holes in some of the rocks. I don't know, does anybody else get that it has kind of an exotic feel to it?
Yes, I agree about the cliffs. It's true. The rock.
I think maybe it's also, like
Yeah.
I said, because of the color, like the blues and the purples, that they're exotic colors that you would see sometimes in depictions and imagery that come from that area of the world, you know, because that's the color of like their rocks and their sand type thing. Not necessarily blue, but like the more gray, kind of purpley looking. Okay, now moving on to another female artist. You know, if I'm missing artists that you expected me to go over in certain sections, I also just want to say, I want to say number one, that, you know, we can't go over everything and everybody. And it's nice to learn about ones that you didn't necessarily know, even though we like seeing things that are familiar. But I also tried to go for a little bit more female artists, just to try and give them a little bit more exposure, and to introduce a little bit more female work, just because I don't think it gets a lot of representation in a lot of classes classically. So Charlotte Schreiber was a painter whose work is defined by an attention to detail and realistic renditions of everyday or literary scenes, most often executed in oil. She's credited with bringing high realism to Canada when she moved from England with her husband in 1875. She trained in London and then started her practice in Canada, and she exhibited at the Royal Academy of London, the Paris Salon, and later in Canada and the United States. So she was well versed in exhibiting in different places. In 1880, she was a founding member of the Royal Canadian Academy, along with Lucius O'Brien, as we saw, and the first woman elected as full academic advisor, although she was not allowed to attend meetings or partake in policymaking, which there's definitely problems there. Her diploma painting for the RCA, which was the Crappie Boy, which we're going to see next, is a fine example of her meticulous rendition of the human form combined with a literary source of inspiration. So this particular painting, Springfield, on the credit, 3 children who are playing in the snow. And, you know, we get the idea of the Canadian landscape with the snow again, as I was saying, but her, it's interesting because her use of realism, we don't see it so much in this painting, but I wanted to show this painting because I found it was interesting that this was like looser brush strokes, and the faces were less defined than we see in most of her work. So here we have Study for the Crappie Boy, which I just wanted to show because at that time, people would make, and it still happens today, but some artists will make studies of paintings, but the studies are just as beautiful, and they're like really defined paintings. So that's like kind of like a rough copy. So if they're doing a rough copy that's so defined, think about how meticulous they are with their actual finished products. So like I said, this was the study, and this was the actual painting. So the Crappie Boy, or the Confession of an Irish Patriot, illustrates an 1845 ballad about the Irish Rebellion of 1798. The song tells the story of a young patriot who confesses his intention to join the insurrection before going off to fight. But the priest is actually disguised. The priest is actually a disguised British soldier, and the lad is sentenced to death. Excerpts of the ballad accompanied the painting when it was shown in the 1879 annual exhibition of the Ontario Society of Artists, and where she showed her painting as her diploma work in 1880, as I mentioned before. So we can see, this is a much better example of her being known as a hyper-realist. The details on the face of the soldier particularly are quite remarkable, as is the staff of the, where we see like the Christ on the cross, the detail that's in that sort of part of the painting is really, you really get the feeling for it being gold as well as his buttons. We see that his sword is on the floor, sort of being sheltered by his cloak. But the artist purposely shows us that, the side that the Crappie Boy can see is just all cloaked, but the side that the artist can see that would be covered by the soldier's hand, by his right hand, which is like right in the face of the Crappie Boy. Anyway, so we can see on the other side that he's actually dressed as a soldier underneath.
What is a Crappie Boy? What does that mean, Crappie?
So I guess so in brackets, it's the confession of the Irish patriot. So I guess a crappie boy is like an Irish patriot, and they refer to him as a young lad. So I suppose it's a young lad who's an Irish patriot who wants to join the insurrection. So I guess that's what is referred to as a crappie boy.
Okay, thank you. Interesting how the crucifix is wedged into the wooden chair. Is it a permanent fixture?
I don't know,
Really?
but like I was looking at that, it looks like it's
Yeah, it's
either a
bizarre.
permanent fixture onto it or is wedged in between the arm of
Yeah.
the chair and the seat of the chair.
Yeah, but anyway, that's a confessional, eh? The scene is a confession.
Yes,
Is
exactly.
that so it's a kind of an open confession. You know,
Yeah.
today's confession, you're in a little cubicle.
Mhm.
Well, from what I remember,
Sometimes.
many years,
Perhaps
that's decades.
you know, you can see also that the crucifix plays a prominent role in the painting, because you can see that the crappie boy's eyes are fixated on Christ, right? And he has his hand on his chest. So clearly it has to do with that. But the British officer, you can see is not looking at at the crucifix whatsoever. He's just looking down sort of with shame onto the crappie boy. I also think it's really interesting how she took the time to make that detail in the top left hand of the painting, where you can see the brick coming through the cement masonry with the little cracks in the wall. And here we have a painting of hers, which is Naughty Girl, which kind of, I don't know, I find that it kind of fits in between the first image that I showed of hers and the hyper detail. Like the first image that I showed of hers with the 3 children, the faces were like the features were very soft. You know, you couldn't see very much detail, even though she's considered as a champion hyper realist, which we saw in the previous painting. But here again, the lines are softened a little bit. And I wonder if the lines are softened a little bit because of the context of the imagery, you know, because it's women and children. You know, in the first image, it was children. In this image, it's women and children. Are the lines softened because it's a sort of softer subject matter? You can see the resemblance between mother and daughter. And it's really their faces, the color of their skin that that stands out, because both of their dresses are very similar in color, and the placement of the 2 figures has, you know, almost everything but their heads up against that wood background, which again, you know, their dresses kind of melt into the background. So it's really the skin texture, the skin color that stands out the most. And you can see that it's like faded tapestry or faded kind of wallpaper, because you don't really see much detail throughout the painting. But then right beside the mother's head, like up against her back, you see a detail in the wall. And that's meant to show that whatever that pattern was, those details were, they were faded elsewhere. And it kind of mimics the shape of the flower that she has on her dress, flower or brooch. So here we have Décoché à Montréal, which is the scene in Place d'Armes from Alfred Boisseau that I had mentioned before when we saw the first painting of the boat at the Montreal harbor. It mentioned that similar, a bustling scene from Montreal, similarly was this one from Alfred Boisseau. So this is set in Place d'Armes, a commercial and financial hub in the heart of the 19th century Montreal. Alfred Boisseau meticulously portrays 3 fur-clad cab drivers pitching their services to a well-to-do couple. The hustle, familiar because that still kind of happens. The hustle and bustle that surrounds the scene and the fine attire of the ladies strolling in front of a shop are signs of a prosperous, flourishing city. Boisseau was well known for his portraits of prominent figures, including politicians like Louis-Joseph Papineau, but here he illustrates a facet of Montreal's economic life with a genre scene. So these genre scenes were also popular around the time. We talked about, towards Confederation, a lot of the depictions and paintings were to do with expansion. Now, whether that was expansion of, the railroad, so scenes depicted from across the Canadian landscape, going from, Montreal across to, like we said, out from Montreal to the prairies, and then eventually to the Rockies and the Pacific coast. So that's one idea of expansion. And then the other idea of showing expansion is like economic expansion. So this kind of scene would be associated with that kind of discourse, showing a prominent, bustling Montreal corner with people who are dressed as though they are well-to-do, meaning, business is booming, economics are doing well, and the city is expanding. So this is giving out rations to the Blackfoot Indians. So it depicts a scene witnessed by the young painter William Brimner during his travels in the Northwest Territories. In a dark, cramped space, shabbily dressed Blackfoot Indians are lined up to collect rations of flour distributed by a white settler. The work's originality lies in the absence of stereotypes, frequently used to represent Aboriginal people at the time, such as bucolic landscapes strewn with teepees, feathered headdresses, and traditional ceremonial garments. So very much like the work of Paul Kane, which we saw before, which was, full of stereotypes. In this painting, we see something that is more realistically depicted. And William Bremner is he was an art educator in Quebec. And he was named the director of the art association of the director of the art school in Montreal. And one thing that he thought was important was to depict imagery more realistically like this one, and to stop glorifying Eurocentric stereotypes of the Indigenous people. So I thought that this painting was important to show, although it's hard to look at, when we think about the way that Indigenous people view art history from that particular time, that they were, they weren't really included into art history as artists. They were only included into art history as subject matter. And that is one of the massive problems with their role in Canadian art history. But at least this kind of imagery is true to the history, whereas the other one makes it look a lot more glamorous than what it was. the artist also uses that dim lighting to as a visual metaphor for, you know, the dimness of what their life was like at that time. Nobody looks happy. Nobody is looking each other in the eye. Everybody's eyes are to the ground. It's a very sad painting. So here we have Homer Watson on the Grand River. So Homer Watson was a self-taught artist, and he moved to Toronto in 1874, where he spent time in the Toronto Normal School and at the Notman photography studio. He continued to travel for his work, and he began to follow the Hudson River School after a trip to New York. In France, he learned from the plein air Barbizon painters, which that was the beginning of, like, that was the precursor to the Impressionist movement, was the plein air painters of the Barbizon school. So considering the fact that he learned from them, we start to see in his work sort of references to plein air, to Barbizon school, to what became Impressionism. In 1907, Watson became a founding member and president of the Canadian Art Club. He served as president of the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts from 1918 to 1922. Big fan of this one. So this is before the storm. So the simplified composition and wealth of detail make Before the Storm one of Homer Watson's most original works. The lowering sky and the luminous road that opens the landscape create bold contrasts of lighting and convey the atmospheric tension that precedes the storm. For this attention to cloud masses in paintings like this one, Watson was dubbed the Canadian Constable in reference to the British painter John Constable, known for romantic landscapes with vast cloud-strewn skies. So I find that this painting is like the sky is heavy. You feel it looming over the landscape, over that white sort of gravel sand road. And the angle at which the cows are painted, it's as if you're looking at them not dead on, but from a little bit above, as if you're the cloud coming down on it. And I just love how dramatic the difference between the dark sky and the white road, or the off-white road, is. Again, hyper contrast of color, like we saw in the waterfall from Krieghoff versus his stormy sky, but this is like a step up from that dramatic contrast. See here again, this is the ravine. We are starting to see more movement in paintbrushes and in paint strokes. We're starting to see lines that aren't quite as sharp. Again, comparing it to Krieghoff's waterfall, we saw in the waterfall that the trees were being moved by the wind, but the trees were still in hyper detail. So you could still see sort of the needlework in the pine trees. Whereas this, not only can you tell that it's windy by the fact that the trees are bent, but you can tell that it's windy because it feels windy. Like it feels like there's movement in the trees because it's a little bit blurred. It feels like, well, that the sky is moving quickly because the clouds are a little bit blurred. It feels like it's very windy because maybe there is like some sand or or dust that is in the air because the view of the house roof is a little bit blurred. So we're starting to get towards that idea of the movement of Impressionism. As we see here again, but this, the floodgate, it has a little bit more, it's a little bit less blurred, but still just as much movement. So Watson was the first Canadian artist to sell a painting to the Marquis of Lorne for Queen Victoria's collection, and was the first elected artist to the Royal Academy, the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts. So Lucius O'Brien was the first elected director, and under him, the first elected artist was Watson. In this work, he uses dramatic lighting to portray the human struggle against the forces of nature. The artist's contemporaries drew a parallel between this work and those of, like we said, English romantic artists like John Constable for the similar style and subject matter. In 1880, the Marquis of Lorne, then Governor General of Canada, purchased the Pioneer Mill for in 1878 for Queen Victoria. This event launched Watson's career. However, he considered the Floodgate to be his first masterpiece. This painting later received a bronze medal at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. In 1914, Watson was commissioned to paint the first Canadian expeditionary force at Valcartier, Quebec. He was awarded the bronze medal at London's Colonial and Indian exhibition in 1886. Also won prizes in Toronto. On the days after his death, the University of Western Ontario awarded Watson an honorary doctorate. So a very celebrated painter in Canadian history. So here we have The Phantom Hunter, which was inspired by the poem The Walker of the Snow by Irish-born writer Charles Dawson Shanley. It depicts a fallen hunter begging for help from a ghostly figure indifferent to his plea. Shown at the 1888 Paris Salon, this work was pivotal in the career of William Blair Bruce, in that it was the first major canvas he produced after a severe depression and the loss of hundreds of his paintings in an 1885 shipwreck. While the meaning of the picture remains enigmatic, some see it as a metaphor for the artist's recovery and determinately creative spirit. So William Blair Bruce actually became one of the first Canadian Impressionists. So we will see this work is not considered Impressionist, but we will see a few of his paintings when we visit the next section of Impressionism. And although this work wasn't considered to be Impressionist, I feel like it's an interesting juxtaposition of the ghost and the real figure, because the ghost is almost in Impressionist, like it is almost Impressionistic style, in that it's very whimsical, and it's meant to be a ghost, so you're not meant to be able to see it very clearly, but it's almost as if he used the same kind of techniques and skill that you would use to create an Impressionist style painting to execute the ghost. But we can see that the image of the hunter is very detailed.
Very detailed. It almost looks like a photograph.
Yeah, like
of a
especially the
man.
leg, right?
Yeah,
Especially
and the
the leg
face and
the boot.
everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find that the seam of his pants is like the most detailed part of the painting. And again, that classically Canadian juxtaposition against a blizzard of snow, a very cold day, that we get we can feel the frigid air. So as we move closer to 1900, so this is a Paul Peel painting, and this painting is actually considered to be an impressionist style painting. So, but there's elements of it that would say, you know, otherwise, particularly the time that it was completed, for considering that he was a Canadian artist. But for artists who went to study in Paris around this time, their work really took a shift into the Impressionist style, which when they came back to Canada with these Impressionist paintings, the Canadian market was not very accepting of it at first, just as the European market, the French market, wasn't very accepting of French Impressionism at first either. Oops. There's a question or a comment. So Astrid says that she has a print of this painting in her bathroom. I have a print of this painting in my daughter's room. So yeah, a very well-known painting in Canadian art history. So Paul Peel's After the Bath addresses the subject of childhood by portraying two nude children fresh from the bath, warming themselves by a fireplace. Peel lends further warmth to the atmosphere by accentuating the chiaroscuro effects in the scene, which, as I mentioned before, is the idea of high contrast between light and dark. So I mean, it's a lot more present in when we saw it in the studio by Kreekhoff, but here it exists in the idea that there's shadows in the corner, but then highlights from the fire. But it's softened, which is that impressionistic style. So shown at the 1890 Salon de la Société des Artistes Français in Paris, the painting won a third-class medal, a first in the history of Canadian art. After the Bath was praised by critics in France, but Canadian viewers, not understanding the painter's intention of expressing the innocence of childhood, were disconcerted by the display of nudity. So as I was saying, you know, Impressionism had begun a couple of years prior in France. So by this time, the French market was more accustomed to this kind of imagery, but for Canadians, this almost, I mean, not almost, for the Canadian market, it seemed inappropriate. One of the classic characteristics of Impressionism too is its treatment of children. So before Impressionism, children were displayed, you know, playing sometimes, but they were often displayed in relation to adults, so in relation to their parents. So if they were added into an image, they were added as like secondary, or if there weren't any adults in the image, it was often because they were doing something, like it was more of like a portrait type thing, unless it was female artists. You know, we saw with Charlotte Schreiber that, and we see with female artists along the timeline, the art historical timeline, that they're much more likely to paint children because they're most likely painting their own children, which is their subject matter, which is what they're around all the time. Classically, women artists paint women and children. But when it came to men painting children, Impressionism sort of brought on this new sort of leisurely way to paint children just as subject matter rather than an actual figurative study like back in the Renaissance type thing. So this was all to say that this was being accepted already in France, but the Canadian mentality wasn't really there yet. So it wasn't a well accepted painting in the Canadian market at first. And again, I just wanted to show this because this is where art is moving at this time, getting close to the end of the 1800s. but we're still seeing material like this. So it's hard to go from that painting by Paul Peel to this painting by Charles Alexander, which is still very like very fluent imagery that at that time, you know. So there's a very, very stark contrast between Paul Peel's painting and this one. So, l'Assemblée des Six Comtés à Saint-Charles-sur-Richelieu depicts a historic scene with a revolutionary subject. The event was a demonstration attended on October 23rd and 24th by 6,000 Patriot Party supporters protesting British colonial rule, specifically the Russell Resolutions. The Assembly of Six Counties, was the peak point of the popular unrest that led to the Patriot Rebellion of 1837. This work exemplifies the nationalistic painting being produced in that period. So although this was long ago before, before Confederation, I wanted to show this imagery because this kind of thing, like this kind of mentality was still around, to look at these kind of paintings and to have these kinds of paintings hanging in your home. So if you have something like this hanging somewhere, it would be hard for you to place a painting like Paul Peel's right beside it. So it took the Canadian population and the Canadian art market and society a while to kind of catch up. So now this is Ozias Leduc. I think that Ozias Leduc is the last that we're going to be able to go through today. I have a few paintings from him that I'd like to show. And then next week we'll start by finishing up this section, and then we'll start into Impressionism. So I mentioned Ozias Leduc when we were looking at religious art and architecture. As we saw, he had paintings in the church in Montreal and also the Marguerite Bourgeois Chapel. So he was a very prominent church painter, but as I mentioned then, we were going to see that he became a very prominent figure in art in Canada and specifically Quebec. So in the first half of the 20th century, Ozias Leduc was one of Quebec's most important painters. He was born 3 years before the signing of the British North American Act and died just as the signs of the Quiet Revolution were beginning to appear. Yet he was not a transitional figure. Instead, he embodied continuity. The changes that appear in his work reflect the sociocultural transformations that marked his lifelong focus on the centrality of art. Leduc's first purpose of art was to manifest humanity's highest values, and these were expressed through beauty. His legacy defined by an artistic ideal centered on research and study to achieve a greater knowledge of self. He would profoundly affect Canadian art, not only through the work he created, but also through the lasting impression he left on his students. So all that to say that he didn't stick with one style of painting. His career spanned over about 70 years, and he dabbled in all different styles. His purpose and focus in art was to remain relevant by moving with the different styles of art, but also continuously perfecting his own skill. So in this painting, which is my favorite still life ever, the human and physical nature, art history, and the properties of different materials are combined. Elements are intermingled, jumbled, piled atop of each other, while the shapes are juxtaposed in a tight grouping on a small surface. The title refers to the principal theme pictured, a skull covered in numbers. In 1825, Austrian neurologist Franz J. Gall published a treatise demonstrating how different cerebral activities were localized in specific areas of the brain. From these observations, he hypothesized that the configuration of the skull could help to define individual personality. This very general theory led to more advanced research, which continues to this day, into the functions of the different parts of the brain. The picture itself is a meditation on the act of creating a work of art, a consideration that has been central to and advanced by all modern and contemporary art. As art historian François Margagnon has observed, Leduc presents three elements that he believes are essential to the creation of a work of art: technique, science, and inspiration. The artist's materials pictured include a porte-crayon, so like to hold a device for holding like a pencil, charcoal, brushes, a compass, tubes of color, paper, and an eraser. Scientific inquiry is present in the objects of study, including books and the phrenological bust. For inspiration, Leduc shows other works of art, including a landscape and a mythological scene. By grouping these together, Leduc skillfully arranges on a small table everything that is needed for the creation of a work of art. Phrenology, which the artist kept for himself, shows the precision of still life painting early in his career. By a chance occurrence in 1892, this 1892 artwork ended up as the property of a museum of contemporary art. It belonged to collector Maurice Corbet before being acquired by the Lavalin engineering firm. And later it was sold to the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montréal. So the reason why this is my favorite still life is because it represents like the making of a work of art. And I just thought that I actually wrote a paper on this when I did my first degree in art history at Concordia. And it just, you know, if you did the last course with me when we talked about still life, we talked about a certain aspect of still life, a certain kind of still life called vanitas. And a vanitas is a kind of still life that is like, it's like an autobiography of the artist. Like it represents like elements that mirror the artist. And I find that that's probably one of the reasons why Ozias Leduc ended up keeping this painting, is because for him it was like his formula for creating a work of art. And so it's like a looking glass into what was going on inside of Ozias Leduc's head when he, like every time he went to create a work of art. So I find it very, very poetic. So here we have three apples, which classic to still life seems very simple, but it can have very sort of not complicated, but very descriptive meaning. And so three apples is arranged in a shallow bowl on a wooden table with a damaged edge, a subject so simple that it evokes an entire universe. At the age of 23, Leduc expresses the essence of symbolism, which seeks to pierce appearances and reveal what is hidden behind the surface of objects of the material and of the material world. By choosing to show the three apples as perfectly spherical and grouping them in a bowl so that their base, stalk, and stem are visible, Leduc demonstrates both the complexity and the unity of the plant world. The three sphere haloed by the circle of the bowl appear to evoke the Christian Trinity. Indeed, the space occupied by the apples is bathed in a magical light that both emanates from them and is absorbed by them, while the surroundings and background remain dark. So a very poetic description, and that was by Ozias Leduc's like by his biographer. And it speaks to Ozias Leduc's sort of beginnings in Christian and church art. So again, if you are familiar with any studies to do with still life. There's a lot of early still life had, religious meanings to it. And in a lot of still life, you would see things in threes, which would symbolically refer to the Holy Trinity. So that's the idea of what the apples are doing here. The work of the carpenter and of the apple grower, trades practiced by Leduc's father, are at the heart of the picture. The spiritual father and the natural father are combined in this homage to creation. The painting celebrates the results of the workman's labor and recognizes the importance of toil and creativity in both art and manual work. Lessons Leduc learned from his early childhood. So his father was a carpenter, and they had an apple orchard up in Saint-Hilaire. So the image of an apple is something that we see come up more than once in his career, and something that was clearly very important to him. So here we have still life with a lay figure, nature morte dite au mannequin. So the end of a table is placed against a window with a white curtain. A rich pearly light filters its way through. Books, magazines, a letter opener, a sketchbook, a round mirror, and some drawings are piled on the table along with the mannequin and a bas-relief of an emaciated man wrapped in blue drapery and set against a red background. The work environment reveals a certain amount of chaos in the stacks of papers interleaved and piled on top of each other. We have like overlapping drawings, images within. Some of them are opaque, others are transparent. And there's even preparatory sketches for the decoration of the Saint-Hilaire church, including a page taken from a sketchbook. The mirror in the center, which kind of looks like it could be a picture, but it's actually a mirror in the center, offers like a micro reflection of this creative space and reflects bits of the room's decor, including some elements that do not appear in the picture itself. So that's another aspect that we see, another detail that we see a lot in still life, and specifically in Vanitas, are mirrors, because it's a metaphor for looking into one's own soul, like looking into the reflection of yourself and what your reflection shows. So the articulated mannequin, which Leduc used to study poses when he was out without a live model. So he used to use that mannequin as a model, and it's associated with the reflection of what seems to be a detail from a painting of two figures in prayer. So lots of sort of very religious details in here, but it says, and that's why it's like, it says still life with a lay figure, meaning the mannequin, but all of the other aspects of the painting have something to do with religion. So it's a religious still life, but the focus in his title is on the lay figure. So for Leduc, like, still life is an occasion to reflect on the nature and significance of objects when they are combined. So this is like a juxtaposition of lay versus religious, a sort of, conflicting dynamic, if you will. He was also very proficient in realism. So this work, we have a boy who's playing a harmonica, eating food and a piece of bread. So it's the idea of a very simple life with very simple imagery that isn't, there's no special details in this picture. It's like, it's a very straightforward wall. His clothing is not fancy. Nothing he's doing is fancy. There's not a lot of frilly detail work. The paintbrush strokes are very, very meticulously applied so that we don't see texture in the painting. It's one of Leduc's studies that shows his skill in creating realistic depictions of people, and they're portraits, but like portraits and genre scenes at the same time. He would create quite a few of these, and I think that this image is quite known from him. This is another one. So in this genre scene, there's a boy who's writing, and we cannot see exactly what he's writing or what he's reading, but he seems very focused. But this is sort of like, you know, whereas the boy that we saw before just sitting there eating with the bread was more of his, like more towards portraiture and genre. I feel like this one is, it relates to portraiture, to genre, but also to his still life works, because we see quite a few of the elements that we would see in his still life works. We see that glass that has paint brushes in it that we saw from his, that we saw in phrenology, and the stacks of books from phrenology, and also still life with a lay figure. This boy seems to be a little bit more artistic and a little bit less sort of on the manicured side as the other boy was. Like he seems like his clothing are a little bit more free flowing, and you know, we can see his tuft of hair coming out from under his hat. So already he seems a little bit more, I don't know, artistic, if you will. And we just have 2 more slides that we're going to do from Leduc. So this here, the reader. So this is a classic portrait by Leduc. So we've seen 3 now, and all of them have kind of a different style, but all of them seem to be concentrated on something. So the first boy was playing his harmonica, so we didn't see his eyes. It's not like a straightforward portrait. The second one was the boy who was reading, and he seemed to be concentrated in his work. And again, here we have the reader from 1894, which she is concentrated on what she's reading. This is actually the artist's sister who poses for this painting, which is part of the greater series of works. Like the past 3 paintings have all been part of the same series that he did. So this just to show you, actually we have 3 more now. Just to show you, this is one of the kinds of landscapes that Ozias Leduc did. So this is the Chaquette farm in Belleuil. This is one of those examples of a painting, a winter landscape where it's mostly white or different variations of white or gray, but somehow he still is able to get this amazing depth of field, and you get a real feel for the weather, the temperature, the feeling in the air. And in contrast to that, we have this one here, which is his old family house. And then lastly, we have the Green Apples by Leduc. So I mentioned before that the idea of apples had come up numerous times into the works of Ozias Leduc. And so this is another one. So this is 1914-15, and we see that the apples have been treated differently here than they were in the last time that he did the apples. So the last time he did them, it was more of a still life. Here we are out in the countryside, because you can, or out in the apple orchard, because you can see that there's another tree in the background, and you can see that there's fields, in the background in the middle, and then you can see that there's fields that are out to the right. So this being 1914-15 was when Impressionism was making its mark in Canada, or starting to anyway. And so we can see that the apples are treated differently in this image than they were in the last. In this image, they have more of a glow to them, like he's almost used iridescent paint. And you can see the movement in his strokes, particularly in the sky that looks like it's glowing, but you can see that it has that impressionistic style where there's a mix of colors, contrasting sort of pinks on blues and yellows on blues. And the movement in the paint strokes are much more free flowing, especially in contrast to what the kind of technique he was using for his portraits and genre scenes. So I just wanted to give you a like an array of the different styles of Leduc's painting techniques, because he was so versed in so many different styles that I just thought it important to give a taste of all of them. And that is going to bring us to the end of our lecture for today. We're a few minutes past schedule. Sorry about that. I just want to encourage you, because there's so much written on Ozias Leduc. You could do a whole course on him, and I didn't have enough time or space to give a proper feel for the breadth and depth of his work. So I encourage you that if there's one artist out of today that you're going to go and look at further, you'll get a really great idea for what art history in Quebec specifically looked like over a period of 70 years, because that's how long his career spanned, and all the different styles that he was able to execute during that time frame. So, any questions, comments, anything?
Amazing paintings. They're beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful work.
Erin, I just want to say that after one of your old courses, I said to Peter, I will never look at a still life the same way again.
Yeah.
I said, I had no idea. So I was very
Absolutely.
good. When those three apples came up, my first thought was, oh, the Trinity, maybe? And I never in my lifetime would have thought that, except after your course. So anyhow.
Yeah.
Well,
Wonderful.
Yes, still life is, I mean, it's one of the most underrated genres of painting, and one of the most interesting genres of painting, because in still life, it's like you can say things without saying them, so you can be sneaky about it, you know?
Yeah, but I never would have dreamed any of that. To me, it was just still life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
interesting. Thank you.
So we have just a few more slides to go through at the beginning of next class, and then we'll be moving our way into the beginnings of Impressionism and so on and so forth.
Wonderful.
So if there's
Thank you, Erin.
my pleasure. So if there's anything that you need, or any questions that you have, you can always email me before next class, or we can do questions or comments at the beginning of next class if ever you would like to. And otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording. And otherwise, we will see you all next week.
Hey, have a great week, everyone.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Bye.
Thanks,
you.
Erin. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
week.
Thank you. You too.
Erin,
Yes.
you're still on? It's
Absolutely.
Gwen.